Welcome, dear listener, to Family Shadows, a place where stories of fathers, children, and the silent battles inside every home come to life. If you find meaning in these reflections, don't forget to subscribe, because every week we bring you tales that remind us of sacrifice, of gratitude, and of the lessons families too often forget. Tonight's story is titled, "My kids said I was just their ATM, so I closed the account." Edward Miller had lived 65 years, and most of those years had not been about himself. They were about others, his late wife, his two children, the family that had been both his blessing and his burden. If you looked at him, you might not see much. A modest man with weathered hands, a face lined by time and work, and clothes that carried the faint smell of machine oil and old laundry detergent. But those who knew him, though few really cared to know deeply, would say Edward was steady, dependable, the kind of man who would rather go without than let someone else in his family suffer. Edward's wife, Margaret, had passed away a decade ago, taken suddenly by illness. That was when his children, Stephen and Karen, became the sole focus of his life. In her final days, Margaret had whispered to him in the hospital, her hand frail in his, "Take care of them, Ed. Don't let them feel alone." He promised her, and when Edward Miller made a promise, he kept it, no matter the cost. So he worked longer hours, stretching his retirement savings to cover their needs. He paid Stephen's tuition bills when the boy decided college was too expensive to manage on his own. He covered Karen's credit card debt after she moved out and discovered that independence came with a stack of late notices. And every time they came with another request, always dressed up as necessity, Edward said yes. Not because he wanted to, not because he could easily afford to, but because love, as he understood it, was spelled Y-E-S. For years, Edward told himself it was what any good father would do. Fathers, he thought, are supposed to build bridges for their children to cross safely into adulthood. But what if the children never wanted to walk across? What if they stayed on the bridge forever, demanding that he keep rebuilding it under their feet? Still, Edward didn't complain. That wasn't his way. Instead, he lived quietly. His days were filled with small routines, brewing coffee in the same chipped mug, walking through his modest home that still echoed with Margaret's presence, and balancing his checkbook with careful pen strokes, each number representing a sacrifice his children never saw. On Sundays, he would sit alone in the wooden pew at St. Michael's Church, a place he and Margaret had once gone together. The hymns reminded him of her, but they also steadied him. "Be still and know," the old pastor would say, and Edward was nothing if not still. But being still does not mean one is blind. Edward saw the way Stephen looked at him sometimes, with impatience, as though his father's simplicity were an embarrassment. Stephen, at 37, fancied himself a man of ambition. He spoke often of investments, of opportunities, though his ventures never seemed to last. Karen, at 34, was gentler, but in her own way just as entitled. She had a taste for the comfortable life. New furniture, nice vacations, clothes that cost more than Edward's weekly groceries. Whenever money was tight, she called her father, and Edward, faithful to his promise, opened his wallet. Yet somewhere in Edward's heart a quiet unease had begun to grow. It was not anger, not yet. It was something softer, like a thread being pulled, loosening the fabric of his devotion stitch by stitch. One evening, after wiring money to Stephen for yet another emergency, Edward sat at the kitchen table with his old checkbook. The numbers stared back at him, black ink against pale paper, but what he saw was not dollars. He saw years. He saw hours of labor, weekends missed, small joys denied himself. He saw the new shoes he never bought, the trip he never took, the meals he had quietly skipped so there would be enough left for his children's requests. The page blurred for a moment, his eyes misting, and he whispered to the empty room, "Margaret, am I doing right by them, or am I just making them blind to the world?" The house did not answer. Houses rarely do. But in the silence, Edward realized something painful. His children had stopped seeing him as a father. To them, he was an institution, a convenience. He had become a machine with a PIN code and a balance limit. He was not Edward, the man who once dreamed of retirement by the sea. He was not the husband who had danced with his wife in the kitchen on rainy nights. He was, in their eyes, just an ATM. The thought pierced him deeper than any insult could. Still, Edward said nothing. He folded his checkbook, washed his mug, and turned off the lights. He told himself tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, perhaps, they would call not to ask but to talk, to ask how he was, to remember that he too had needs. But tomorrow never came in that way. And Edward, the quiet father, carried on, unaware that his silence was shaping the storm that would soon arrive. The night of the family dinner had started like many others. Edward set the table carefully, aligning the forks and knives with the quiet precision of a man who knew order was the last thing he could still control. His children had insisted they would bring the food, Stephen with his confident stride, Karen with her usual smile. And so Edward had simply made sure the old wooden dining table, scarred by decades of meals and memories, looked welcoming. He polished the frame of a photo on the mantel, Margaret, forever young in her Sunday dress, before they arrived. Stephen came first, his car's headlights spilling across the driveway like the arrival of someone who wanted to be noticed. He strode in without knocking, phone still in hand, voice booming with half-finished conversations about deals and returns on investment. Behind him, Karen entered with a bag of takeout, the aroma of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes filling the room. "Dad, we figured you wouldn't want to cook tonight," Karen said, kissing his cheek lightly. She looked around as if evaluating the house again, as though every creak of the floorboards reminded her how old and out of step it seemed compared to the lives she and her brother imagined they deserved. Edward smiled. "It's good to have you both here." They sat, plates filled, the sound of forks and knives briefly masking the silence that had become all too common. Edward asked the usual questions. How's work? How's the apartment? But the answers were clipped, distracted, already drifting back toward the glow of their phones or the chatter between them. Then it came, sudden and unfiltered, slipping out of Stephen's mouth like it was nothing more than a fact of life. "You know, Dad," he said, chuckling as he cut into his chicken, "sometimes I feel like you're just our ATM." The words hung in the air. Karen froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. She didn't protest. Instead, she gave a small, nervous laugh, the kind that hides more truth than it denies. Edward looked at his son. The face before him was not the boy he once carried on his shoulders, pointing out constellations in the night sky. It was the face of a man hardened by entitlement, softened only by the arrogance of assuming his father's sacrifice was nothing more than expected. "Stephen," Edward said softly, "is that how you see me?" His son shrugged. "Come on, Dad, don't take it so seriously. You've always been there when we needed money. That's what I mean. Reliable, like an ATM." Karen lowered her eyes. She didn't correct him. That silence, more than Stephen's words, drove the knife in. Edward's hand trembled slightly as he set down his fork. In that moment, he remembered Margaret's voice, her laughter, her unwavering faith that their children would grow to appreciate all that was done for them. How wrong she had been, or perhaps how wrong he had been, in thinking that giving more would eventually teach gratitude. The meal continued in fractured conversation. Edward nodded at Stephen's tales of failed ventures disguised as near successes. He nodded again as Karen spoke about her plans to redecorate her apartment, about how the furniture she bought last year already felt outdated. Every word was a reminder. To them, money was not just a resource. It was the language they spoke, the currency of their affections. When the plates were cleared, Edward excused himself, stepping into the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, the murmur of his children's voices drifting in from the dining room. His chest ached, not from age, but from the hollow space where respect should have lived. Margaret had once said, "Ed, the kids will mirror what they see in us. If we show them love, they'll learn to love. If we show them sacrifice, they'll learn to sacrifice." But now Edward wondered, what if too much sacrifice only teaches them to expect more? He returned to the table, his face composed, though his heart was anything but. Later that evening, after they had left, the house felt larger, emptier. Edward walked through the rooms, each corner echoing with absence. He sat at his desk and pulled out the old checkbook again. With slow, deliberate strokes, he wrote down the sums he had given away: tuition, debts, rent, cars, vacations. The total was staggering, but what struck him more was the silence of the ledger. No thank yous were written in the margins, no notes of love or gratitude. Just numbers, endless and cold. Edward closed the book and pressed his palms against it, as though trying to keep the years from spilling out. ATM, he whispered. The word didn't belong in a home, in a family. Yet there it was, spoken casually, as though it were the most natural description of him. That night he could not sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing again and again his son's laughter at the dinner table, his daughter's silence. His heart pounded not with anger, but with sorrow, the sorrow of a man who realized that in giving everything he might have lost the one thing he longed for most, to be seen not as a provider but as a father. The next morning, Edward rose before dawn as he always did. He brewed his coffee, the bitter steam curling upward. He looked out the window at the quiet street where neighbors still slept. For the first time, he felt the weight of his years pressing hard against him. The years he had left were fewer than those behind. And he asked himself, as he held that chipped mug close to his lips, do I really want to spend the rest of them being nothing more than an ATM to my own children? The question lingered, unsettling, as the first light of morning broke through the curtains. Edward knew, deep down, that the answer would shape the rest of his life. For 10 years, Edward Miller had become fluent in a language his children never learned, the quiet mathematics of sacrifice. It began with Stephen's first emergency. He had just graduated, restless and eager to carve his mark. But ambition without patience is like building a house without a foundation. It collapses under its own weight. When his credit card debts piled higher than his paycheck, he called his father. "Dad, I just need a little help," Stephen said over the phone. "Just a bridge to get me to next month." Edward remembered the word bridge. He thought of himself as one. Fathers, he told himself, are bridges meant to be crossed so their children can reach safer ground. So he paid the bill. A month later, another call, then another. Soon the bridge no longer led anywhere. It simply circled back to him, again and again, demanding to be rebuilt. Karen was different in manner but not in outcome. She had always carried herself with grace, a daughter who seemed to need less discipline than Stephen. But independence proved expensive. The apartment she moved into came with a lease larger than her salary could bear, furniture on installments, clothes bought in bursts of impulse, vacations booked with the assumption that her father would quietly cover the gaps. And Edward did. Each month he stood in line at the bank, pen in hand, filling out withdrawal slips as though signing pieces of his own life away. The tellers knew him by name, greeted him kindly, unaware of the weight behind each transaction. He would leave with less in his account and a polite nod to strangers who had no idea they were witnessing a man giving up the little security he had left. Sometimes, after wiring money, Edward lingered in the bank lobby, staring at the posters on the wall. Smiling couples on sailboats, gray-haired retirees walking along sunlit beaches. "Your future starts today," the slogan read. Edward almost laughed. His future wasn't a beach or a sailboat. His future was an empty chair at a dining table, waiting for children who would only arrive when they needed to withdraw more of him. Still, he told himself this was love. Love, after all, was never about keeping score, but scoreboards exist whether we admit them or not, and Edward's was his checkbook. At night, in the quiet of his home, he opened it, tracing the rows of numbers with his finger. Tuition, $12,000. Car loan, $18,500. Apartment rent, $9,600. Vacation bailout, $3,200. He added them with the slow care of a man both meticulous and resigned. Each sum was a brick removed from the wall of his own security. Once, after transferring money to Karen for a new couch she insisted she couldn't live without, Edward sat at the kitchen table and tried to remember the last thing he had bought for himself. The last indulgence that was purely his. He couldn't. Not a new suit, not a watch, not even a weekend trip to the lake he once loved. His luxuries had been silently redirected into theirs. Yet when his children hugged him when they said, "Thanks, Dad, you're the best," he felt a warmth that almost justified it all. Almost. But warmth fades quickly when it is only borrowed, never returned. There were moments, small, piercing moments, when Edward realized just how invisible his sacrifices had become. Like the time Stephen bragged to his friends that he had handled his debt problem, as if money had fallen from the sky. Or when Karen hosted a dinner in her perfectly decorated apartment, never once mentioning who had written the checks that made it possible. Edward sat through both moments with the same faint smile, though inside something was breaking. He often thought of Margaret then. She had been the balance to his giving nature. She knew when to say no, when to let the children stumble. "Ed," she once told him, "if you always pick them up, they'll never learn to stand." He used to nod, used to agree, but after her passing he couldn't bear the thought of letting them fall. So he lifted them again and again, until he no longer remembered what it felt like to stand for himself. 10 years. 10 years of checks, transfers, withdrawals. 10 years of watching his own future shrink while his children's demands grew. Edward didn't blame them entirely. After all, he had trained them to see him this way. Every yes had built the image of a man without limits. Every silent sacrifice had erased the idea that he might one day need to keep something for himself. He had created the illusion of a bottomless account, and illusions once believed are difficult to shatter. Still, late at night he began to wonder if he stopped, if the money truly ran out, would they still come home? Would they still call? Would they still see him as father, or would the silence on the other end of the line become permanent? The thought terrified him, but more than that, it saddened him. Because beneath all the numbers, beneath the endless giving, Edward's heart longed for something money could never buy: his children's respect, their gratitude, their love untied to the bills he paid. One evening, after another quiet transfer, Edward sat with his old wedding album. Margaret's face smiled back at him from the photographs. In her eyes he saw not the woman he had lost, but the voice he still heard. "Don't give it all away, Ed. Save some for yourself. Save some for the life we once dreamed." For the first time in years, Edward whispered back, "Maybe you were right." And though the house remained silent, Edward felt as though she had heard him. The request came on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day when Edward liked to sit by the window with a paperback, letting the slow hours settle into him like dust motes in the light. He had just poured his second cup of coffee when the phone buzzed. Stephen's name appeared on the screen. "Dad, can we come by?" his son asked, without the courtesy of explanation. "Karen's with me. It won't take long." They arrived together, stepping inside as though the house were still theirs. Edward noticed the way Karen's eyes moved around the living room, as if she were calculating what new furniture might replace the old couch, the old curtains, the old man sitting quietly in front of her. Stephen didn't bother with small talk. He went straight to the point, pacing as he spoke. "Dad, look, we've been thinking. It's time for us to move forward. We found a house. A real house, not an apartment, not some rental. A place in Brookfield. Perfect location, good neighborhood, great schools for when we start families." He paused as if waiting for applause, but Edward simply nodded, hands folded on his lap. Karen chimed in, her tone sweetened but with an edge of insistence. "It's beautiful, Dad. Big windows, a garden in the back. You'd love it. And well, we just need some help with the down payment. Once we're in, we can handle the mortgage ourselves." Edward felt his chest tighten. He had been here before in smaller ways. Tuition, debts, cars, couches. But this was not a bridge. This was an entire foundation they wanted him to build. "How much?" he asked, his voice steady though he already knew the answer would sting. Stephen cleared his throat. 150,000. Between the two of us, we can cover the rest. But if you could just sign off, Dad, it would mean everything. You know, just this one big push and then we're set for life." Karen leaned closer. "Think of it as an investment in us. We're your future." Edward looked at them, really looked. His son, nearly 40, speaking like a teenager asking for allowance. His daughter, mid-30s, selling dreams she hadn't built herself. He thought of Margaret, the life they once imagined, modest, careful, rooted in gratitude. He thought of all the years he had said yes. And then he thought of the checkbook, the numbers lined up like tombstones of his retirement, his peace, his dignity. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rose slowly from his chair and walked to the kitchen. He needed space, air. He placed his hands on the counter, staring at the cracks in the tiles he had meant to fix but never did. Behind him, he heard their voices, Stephen's confident, Karen's coaxing, both circling him like salesmen around a reluctant client. When he returned to the living room, he sat down again, meeting their eyes one at a time. "You want me to give you my future," he said softly. Stephen frowned. "No, Dad, we're asking you to help us build ours. You can't take that money with you when—" He stopped, catching himself before the word "gone" escaped, but Edward had already heard it. Karen reached for his hand. "Please, Dad, this house will make everything stable. We'll finally feel like we've made it, and you'll be part of that." Her touch was warm, her voice pleading, but beneath it Edward heard something else. Expectation. Not gratitude, not love, just certainty that he would do what he had always done. For a long moment the room was silent except for the ticking of the old mantel clock. Edward's gaze shifted to Margaret's photograph, resting in its frame. Her smile seemed almost alive, as if waiting for him to remember the promise he made, not just to her but to himself. Edward inhaled deeply. His hands no longer trembled. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost gentle. "Children, I've given you both more than I ever kept for myself. And every time, I told myself it was love. But now you're asking me for more than money. You're asking me to trade the years I have left, the security your mother wanted me to have. That's not love, that's forgetting who I am." Stephen's jaw tightened. "So what, you're just going to let us struggle after everything we've done to get this far?" Edward met his gaze. "Struggle is how you learn. I've kept you from it for too long, and maybe that was my mistake." Karen pulled her hand back, her eyes glistening. She opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. The silence between them was heavy, not the silence of peace but of fracture. In that silence, Edward realized something. This was not the end of their asking, but it would be the end of his giving. The conversation drifted after that, neither side willing to press further. They left with tight smiles, Stephen muttering about opportunities lost, Karen lingering in the doorway as if hoping he would change his mind. But Edward didn't. He watched their car pull away, the taillights vanishing down the street, and for the first time in years he felt the faint stirrings of resolve. He walked back inside, poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, and sat in the quiet house. It felt different now, still lonely, still worn, but no longer a prison of obligation. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache, Edward sensed the beginning of a new thought. Maybe it was time to live not as a bridge, not as an ATM, but simply as a man who had earned the right to keep something for himself. That night after Stephen and Karen had left, the house felt heavier than ever. Not with noise, but with absence. Edward stood at the window, watching the darkness swallow the last trace of their car. The taillights had been bright, almost too bright, and then they were gone, leaving him with the hum of silence. He turned back toward the living room. The takeout boxes they had brought still sat on the table. Half-finished plates, crumpled napkins, the faint smell of roasted chicken. He picked them up one by one, not with anger, but with the weary patience of a man who had always been left to clean up after others. He rinsed the dishes, wiped the counters, folded the cloth with deliberate care. These small acts gave him something his children could not: order. Later, he carried himself into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. Margaret's photo was there, in its familiar place on the nightstand. He touched the frame with his fingers, tracing the outline of her smile. "You'd know what to do," he whispered. "You'd know when enough is enough." For years he had answered every call, every request, as though he were still living under the vow he made to her in the hospital. Take care of them. Don't let them feel alone. But somewhere along the way that promise had twisted. Taking care had turned into enabling. Protecting had become draining. And now he was no longer sure whether he was honoring her or betraying both of them. He leaned back, eyes closed. The memories came: Margaret laughing in the kitchen, Margaret telling him to keep a little for himself, Margaret warning in her gentle but steady way that too much giving can blind the receiver. For the first time in years, Edward allowed himself to consider that she had been right. The next morning he woke before sunrise, as he always did. The habit of early rising was stitched into his bones, even though there was no job waiting for him anymore. He brewed coffee, the smell filling the house with a comfort that felt both familiar and hollow. He sat at the table with his chipped mug, staring at the steam, and thought about the years ahead. How many did he have left? 10, 15 if he was lucky. What did he want those years to be? A parade of withdrawals, each one a piece of himself handed over, or something quieter, smaller, but his. The question lingered, pressing against him like an uninvited guest. After breakfast, he went to the drawer where he kept his finances. The old checkbook, the bank statements, the folders of receipts. He spread them out across the table, the paper forming a map of the past decade. It was all there, every transfer, every bill, every sacrifice. Stephen's debts, Karen's rent, vacations, down payments. Each one a story of need answered without hesitation. He flipped through the pages slowly. The numbers no longer looked like dollars. They looked like years. They looked like days he would never get back. Each withdrawal was a Christmas without Margaret. Each transfer was a day he had said no to himself. For a long time, Edward sat still, the papers spread before him. And then gently he began to gather them up. He placed the checkbook on top, closed the folder, and slid it aside. The act felt final, like the closing of a door. That afternoon he went to the bank. The clerk behind the glass smiled at him, greeting him as they always did. "Good to see you again, Mr. Miller. How can we help you today?" Edward hesitated. For years he had come here to take money out, to move it from his life into the hands of his children. But now he said something different. "I'd like to open a new account." The words sounded strange, almost foreign, but also freeing. He filled out the form, signed his name with a steady hand, and slid the folder of statements across the counter. "This is for me," he told the clerk. She nodded, not knowing how much weight those words carried. Walking out of the bank, Edward felt the sunlight on his face. It wasn't triumph, not yet. But it was something like resolve, something like air after years of holding his breath. That evening, back at home, he made himself a simple dinner. He sat at the table, alone but not lonely, and ate slowly. Each bite tasted different, not because of the food, but because of the knowledge that, for the first time in years, he had said no. It was not a spoken no, not yet. Stephen and Karen didn't know, but inside himself, Edward had drawn a line, and that line would not be crossed. Later, he returned to the bedroom, sat by the nightstand, and looked again at Margaret's photo. "I've made a choice," he whispered. "I'm keeping something for me this time." And though the house gave no answer, Edward felt lighter than he had in a decade. The call came only 3 days after Edward had opened his new account. He had not expected it so soon, though perhaps he should have. His children had learned his patterns, the rhythm of his generosity. They knew exactly how often to ask, how much space to leave before returning with another need. This time, it wasn't a phone call filled with casual requests. It was Stephen himself, arriving at the front door with a folder tucked under his arm, the kind of folder that looked official, the kind that always meant money. Karen was with him, her eyes already rehearsing the plea. "Dad, we'll just sit at the table. This won't take long," Stephen said as he brushed past, his voice confident, rehearsed. Edward followed slowly, his heart steady but heavy. The kitchen table had seen too many conversations like this. It was where he had signed checks, written notes, promised to help just this once. Now the table would see something different. Stephen spread out the papers. "It's the mortgage agreement for the Brookfield house. We've talked to the bank. All that's left is your signature for the down payment transfer. Once you sign, Dad, we're in. This is the chance. This is the one that sets us up." Karen leaned forward, her hands folded neatly as though in prayer. "Dad, you know we can't do this without you. Please, it's for our future." Edward looked at them both. He saw not desperation but expectation. The calm confidence of children who believed the answer would always be yes. And maybe once it would have been, but not anymore. He placed his hands flat on the table, steady, firm. His voice came out quieter than he expected, but it carried weight. No. For a moment the room was utterly silent. The clock on the wall ticked once, twice, filling the space where words should have been. Stephen blinked as though he hadn't heard. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean," Edward said slowly, "I will not sign. I will not give you this money." Karen's eyes widened. "Dad, are you serious? You can't just say no. This is important. This is our life." "This is my life too," Edward replied. Stephen's voice sharpened, his tone cutting through the room. "You've always helped us, always, and now when it actually matters, you're holding back. What kind of father does that?" Edward felt the words land like blows, but he did not flinch. A father who has given more than he should have. A father who realizes that love is not measured in withdrawals. Stephen slammed his hand on the table, the folder shaking. "This is selfish. You sit here in this old house with nothing but memories and you call us selfish. You've been nothing but a provider. That's what you're good at. Why stop now?" Edward's voice stayed calm, though his chest ached. "Because I am not an ATM. I am your father, and fathers are not bottomless." Karen's face softened, her voice trembling. "Dad, please don't do this. We've counted on you. We need this. Just think of it as one last big push. After this, we'll be fine." Edward shook his head. "That's what you said last time, and the time before. I've heard one last time for 10 years. No more." Stephen stood, pacing the room, muttering about betrayal. Karen sat back, tears welling, though Edward wasn't sure if they were tears of hurt or frustration. He reached across the table, not to the papers, but to his children. "I love you both, but love cannot survive if it is only taken, never given back. I will not destroy what little I have left for a house you are not ready to build." Stephen's jaw tightened, his fists clenched. "Fine, if that's how it is, don't expect us to come running when you need something." The words stung, but Edward only nodded. "Perhaps that's fair. Perhaps it's time you stopped running here only when you need something." They gathered the papers in silence, the sound of rustling pages louder than any argument. At the door, Karen turned back, her voice soft but sharp enough to cut. "You'll regret this, Dad." Edward looked at her, his eyes tired but steady. "Maybe, but I think you will too." When the door closed behind them, the house was silent once again. But this time the silence did not feel empty. It felt like the echo of something long overdue. Edward sat back down at the table. His hands trembled slightly now, not from fear but from release. He had spoken a word he had denied himself for a decade. No. And though it hurt, though it carved a canyon between him and his children, it also gave him something he hadn't felt in years. Dignity. A week passed before Edward saw them again. 7 days of silence, broken only by the ordinary sounds of his life. The kettle whistling, the creak of the old floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator that seemed to grow louder in an empty house. For once, the phone did not ring with Stephen's voice demanding or Karen's soft pleas. The quiet was both a comfort and a wound. But Edward knew it would not last. On the 8th day he called them himself. "Come for dinner," he said simply. "I'd like us to sit together." His voice carried no edge, no demand, just an invitation. They came curious, perhaps thinking he had changed his mind. Stephen wore his usual confident smirk, as though certain his father's no had been a temporary lapse. Karen carried a small bouquet of flowers, a gesture meant to soften what she assumed would be reconciliation. Edward greeted them warmly, prepared a simple meal. Roast chicken, potatoes, green beans, the kind of dinner Margaret used to make. They ate in relative peace, though the air buzzed with unspoken questions. When the plates were cleared, Edward rose and walked to the desk in the corner. He returned with two objects, an old, worn ledger book and a crisp new folder. He placed them gently on the table, side by side. Stephen raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Edward opened the old ledger first. The pages were yellowed, corners curled, but the handwriting was steady. He turned it toward them, tapping the columns of figures. "These are the last 10 years of my life," he said. "Every dollar I gave you, every debt I paid, every check I wrote." Karen leaned forward, her brow furrowing as she read. Stephen tuition $12,000. Stephen credit cards $5,800. Karen car loan $18,500. Karen rent $9,600. Stephen investment loss $15,000. Vacation rescue $3,200. Page after page. The numbers stacked like bricks in a wall, only this wall had been built by tearing down Edward's future. "Dad," Karen's voice wavered. Stephen scoffed lightly, though his eyes betrayed unease. "So you kept track, you always were meticulous. What's the point of showing us this?" Edward's gaze met his son's, steady but tired. "The point is not the numbers themselves. The point is what they represent. Years of my life, security I should have kept, promises to your mother that I would not spend my last days in fear of running out." He closed the old ledger and placed his hand on the newer folder. "And this," he said, sliding it closer, "is the account I opened last week, my account for me, for the years I still have left." Karen's lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Stephen leaned back, his jaw tight. "So this is it, you're cutting us off." Edward shook his head slowly. "No, I am not cutting you off, I am cutting myself free." The room was silent except for the ticking clock. Edward's eyes softened as he looked at them. "I love you both, more than you can know, but love has turned into expectation. I gave and you forgot it was giving. You began to see it as your right. And now you want me to sacrifice what little time I have left so you can feel secure in a house you haven't earned. That's not love, Stephen. That's not love, Karen. That's blindness." Karen's eyes filled with tears. She stared at the ledger as though seeing her father for the first time, not as a machine that dispensed money, but as a man who had been quietly bleeding for years. "Dad, we didn't realize it was this much." Edward reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "That's because you never asked, you only took." Stephen crossed his arms, his voice sharp, defensive. "You could have said no any time, don't put this all on us." "I know," Edward said gently. "That is my fault. I should have said no long ago. I should have taught you that struggle is part of living, but I was afraid you'd see me as less if I didn't provide, afraid you'd feel abandoned after your mother died, so I gave more than I had to give, and in doing so I lost myself." He opened the new folder, showing them the blank first page of the account records. "This one will not be touched, not by Stephen, not by Karen. This is for Edward Miller, for the man who gave and now must keep something for himself." The words hung heavy in the air. Karen covered her face with her hands, sobbing softly. Stephen looked away, his mouth pressed into a thin line, unwilling to admit the truth but unable to deny it either. Edward sat back, his body tired but his spirit lighter. For the first time in a decade, he felt as though he had reclaimed something, not money but dignity. The old clock chimed in the corner. The sound was steady, certain, time moving forward, indifferent but unrelenting. Edward looked at his children, broken in their silence, and whispered almost to himself, 10 years. 10 years I gave away. The rest I will keep." The week after Edward revealed the ledger was the quietest week of his life. Neither Stephen nor Karen called. The phone, once a channel of constant requests, sat silently on the counter. At first, the stillness felt like abandonment, but slowly, Edward realized it was also freedom. He filled his days with small things. Morning walks through the park, nodding at neighbors he had never taken time to know. Afternoons with books he had long meant to read, their pages now worn by his patient fingers. He even joined a local community group at the library, where other retirees gathered to share stories, to laugh, to remember that life after 65 still carried color. One evening, as he sat in the park watching the sun sink low, Karen appeared. She walked slowly, her eyes red, her steps hesitant. When she reached him, she sat without a word. For a long while, they watched the sky turn from gold to violet. Finally, she whispered, "Dad, I'm sorry." Edward turned, his face soft. "For what?" "For not seeing you," she said. "For treating you like something you're not. I never realized how much you gave. I thought it was endless. I thought you didn't mind." He placed a hand over hers. "I minded, Karen, but I loved you too much to say so. That was my mistake." Her tears fell then, quiet and real. They did not solve everything, but they watered the roots of something that might grow again: respect. Stephen was different. Days passed into weeks before he showed up. When he finally did, it was not with papers or demands, but with silence. He stood in the doorway, eyes down, hands shoved in his pockets like a boy caught doing wrong. "I guess I was harsh," he muttered. Edward studied him, the man who had once been a child, on his shoulders. "Yes," he said plainly, "but it's not too late to learn." Stephen shifted, uncomfortable, then nodded. It was not an apology, not fully, but it was a beginning. That night after they had both gone, Edward sat at his table once more. The old ledger lay closed in the drawer, the new account safely untouched. For the first time in years, he felt at peace with the numbers. He had finally said no, not out of bitterness, but out of love. Love for himself, and even love for his children, who would one day understand that boundaries were also lessons. He looked toward Margaret's photograph. "I think they are starting to see," he whispered. "Not all at once, but little by little, and maybe that's enough." The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like his own again. Edward realized the costly lesson was not just for his children. It was for him too. That love is not measured by how much you give away, but by what you choose to preserve. That being a father did not mean being an ATM, but being a man who teaches, even if the lesson is hard. And for the first time in a long while, Edward smiled. Not the tired smile of a man trying to hold his family together, but the calm smile of someone who had finally held himself together. Studio, and that, dear listener, is the story of Edward Miller, the quiet father who found his dignity after years of being treated like an endless machine. May we all remember, parents are not banks, and love must never be mistaken for entitlement. Thank you for listening to this story on Family Shadows. If it touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss the next tale we share. I wish you and your loved ones good health, lasting gratitude, and the kind of happiness that only a united family can bring. Take care, and may your home always be filled with warmth.